one of the things that I think is so bizarre about the reasons that managers said they were not hiring Gen Z was they don't have a good work ethic. And I'm like, how did all of us at any point learn a work ethic? You show up at your first job and you do something and somebody goes, you probably don't want to do that around
Yeah,
here. Or that
exactly. Like,
ooh, and that kind of thing, right? We learn from each other. We watch each other. But if you pushed out all the older people and you refuse to provide training to younger people, of course you're going to have a talent shortage. It's just dumb.
you're making too much sense, Janine. It's
Oh
just
no,
too
I'm rarely
logical.
accused of that.
Welcome to It Gets Late Early. Today, I'm very excited to have Janine Vanderburg with me. She is the founder of Changing the Narrative, which is an anti-ageism educational advocacy group. And she's also the CEO of Encore Roadmap, which is a company that exists to promote the value and business case behind intergenerational teams. So happy to have you here. The work you've been doing for a while has been really incredibly impactful. And I can't wait to have you share with the audience what you've done and how people can help you do more.
Maureen, I'm so grateful to be here. And so thank you for inviting me.
You're so welcome. Well, I know one of the things that I created the show and this platform and community to be all about was not just sitting here and complaining about ageism. Like, we all know it's real. We all know it exists. It's terrible. Reality bites, right? But also to figure out what the heck we can do about it. And there was something that you and others did in Colorado that was so incredible in my mind, the Job Application Fairness Act. So can you take us through what that is, what it does, the impact, and also how you got there?
You bet. So one of my mantras is exactly what you said. Let's not talk about it. Let's be about it, right? And one of the things that we realized in talking to older adults around Colorado was the number of people, highly competent, experienced, talented, applying for jobs and then totally being ghosted, not hearing anything back, not having applications applied to. So as we were digging into it, we realized that there was this thing, and people were talking to me about it, and I didn't believe it. And people were saying, they ask you for your high school graduation date on a job application. Well, I haven't applied for a job in forever. So I was like, really? And so I got online and tried to apply for something that I had absolutely no interest in, but I just wanted to see how this worked.
Yeah.
And sure enough, my high school graduation date wasn't really even listed. So I was like,
Oh my
okay, this is
gosh.
nuts. This is real. At the same time, AARP was doing some research that was showing that people were being screened out based on their age and graduation date, even though the law says that it is illegal. Federal law says it's illegal to discriminate against people based on age. So we had this group that we had formed a few years back called the Older Worker Policy Collaborative in Colorado. And it was like a local policy shop. It was the local AARP. It was changing the narrative. It was some individuals who just cared about this whole issue of older adults in the workforce. And previous to that, we had gotten older adults in the workforce on the state's policy agenda. The year before, we had gotten legislation passed to strengthen age discrimination laws because there was a really quirky thing in Colorado law where even if you won an age discrimination case, you couldn't get compensatory damages and you couldn't get punitive damages. Now, anyone who has tried a lawsuit knows that a lawyer isn't going to take you on, right, if you can't get either. So, we had gotten that fixed. So this became kind of our next thing. And everybody told us, oh, this is going to be way too hard and you're not going to be able to do it in a year. And this is sort of the message that I want to get to your listeners. It is possible, and here's how we did it. So first, let me tell you what the Job Application Fairness Act does. It basically prohibits employers on initial job applications, whether they're paper, online, digital, whatever format, from asking for your age, your graduation dates, right? Because for most of us, our high school graduation dates are approximate for our age, or any other age identifier. So it could be your, college graduation date, but something else that would indicate your age. So it prohibits employers from doing that on initial job applications. what employers can do if age is a legit concern. So, for example, you have to be a certain age to get a commercial driver's license. They can put on the application, will you be of this age by the time, of hiring? But that's it. They can't ask age. And the way we got there, and then and we were very careful about this. Employers get kind of one chance to screw up, if you will. They get if they do it and somebody reports them. So what is really important, the enforcement in this is people reporting employers who post job ads or job applications that have this. And so part of the reason that we love programs like yours is the ability to let people know it's not enough that we pass the law. You've got to complain when you see a violation, right? And you can, under this law, you can also complain anonymously because we also understand that if you, Maureen, are applying for a job and you see that they're asking for a graduation date, you don't want your name associated with the complaint, right? With the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. So employers, if there's a complaint, they get one chance to fix it. But then if they don't, there's start to be fines and penalties and so forth. So we got it passed in 2023, but it just went into effect on July 1st, 2024. And there was that leeway to give employers time to prepare, et cetera, because of course the legislature, when we got it through, the legislature said, oh, it's going to be a burden on employers and that kind of thing. And one of the people in our collaborative literally said, they were like, really? Like if you've got a paper application, you can just cross out that question.
Right.
If you've got a digital, you delete it, right? This isn't that hard.
Shouldn't be that hard.
It shouldn't be that hard. So anyway, so that's gone into effect. So we don't really, the hope is this. Our hope is not that a whole lot of people get caught doing it. Our hope is that it's a deterrent effect. But it also gave us an educational opportunity because what happened once it went into effect in July, every law firm, every HR company and everything was sending everything to all their clients saying, note that as of July 1st, you can't do this. It also gave us an opportunity to talk about, okay, you can't do it because the law says, but the reason you don't want to do it is you're missing out on the value that experienced talent brings to the table. One of the things that we were really careful about, and I really want people to do this in other states, but one of the things that we were really careful about was to not make this just about older workers. And we had help there. Resume Builder had done a survey early that year that showed that not only do employers use graduation dates to screen out against older workers, they also use it to screen out Gen Z.
Yep.
So we were able to do that to say, we don't want to do us versus them. It's all of us, right? And who is losing out? We believe that not only are the older and younger workers losing out, but communities, workforces are moving out when you miss that blend of intergenerational talent. So that's what we did. I can talk if you want about how we got it done.
But yes, definitely want to hear about that. And I also want to hear about any of the hurdles that you face, because I can imagine, if people are saying, hey, this is a burden on employers, I'm wondering what other sorts of things they threw at you. I could imagine them saying something like, well, if you pass this, then everybody's going to say they went to Harvard and they have 8 years of experience, right? And how do you check that?
And how do you check that? Yeah, so great question. So first, how we did it. We literally, the good news was that we had a group of people and we all, not only were used to working together, but we all kind of like each other. And I think that was
does help.
That it does help. So the kind of things that were, that kind of come up, and the typical group conflict that you might have in passing something like this of people having different strategies and what we should do, it was easy to work out. And we were meeting weekly as we were, saying, okay, who's talked to which legislature and that kind of thing. But we got some legislators who had been favorable to older adult issues. And we explained to them why this was an issue that affected older adults. And that turned out to be really important because very often legislators who care about older adult issues think of very frail older adults, right? They think about people who need meals and transportation and that kind of thing. And they're not thinking about all the people who really, really just want a job. Or as, my friend, the late, great, also named Maureen, she was on she chaired the Denver Commission on Aging when I served on it. And she said, I wouldn't need a food basket if somebody would give me an effing job. And so I think for a lot of people, for a lot of people, work is really important. It's important for paycheck, but it's also important for meaning and purpose. So there were a lot of people, and so we were used to working together. So we went to those legislators, showed them why it was an issue of concern to older adults. We got them to sponsor it. So that was kind of step one. Then step two, we started all approaching the legislators we knew. But the other thing that we knew, we had data, right? We had data from AARP. We had data from Builder. We had local data, Colorado-based data that I had collected during the pandemic through a research project for changing the narrative. So we had good data. But data doesn't persuade people, right? We need stories. That's why you're so effective all the time, Maureen, in putting those stories out there. We needed stories. And this was a conundrum that we really ran into. All the people who had personally shared stories with me or with other members of our collaborative, all of a sudden, when we wanted them to tell their story to the media or go testify to the legislator, clammed up.
Oh,
now,
man,
why did they do it? I get it. People didn't want the stigma attached, and they thought, I'm out there looking for a job, and if I tell my story, people are going to know people haven't been hiring me, I'll be blackballed. There was a lot of concern, so we had to persuade some people to tell their stories. Two people in particular turned out to be really effective, and for very different reasons. One of them was literally a friend of mine who had given up. She was someone who had been a chief marketing officer for a Fortune 500 and all of a sudden couldn't get a marketing job. She was second in line for a marketing job. And when she got the call back, she was told, well, you're older, so we don't think you'll be good heading up digital media. Now, if anyone had checked her digital media profiles, they would have known that was not the case, right? But she kind of just sort of gave up and started her own thing. So she was willing to tell that story. Another woman who was willing to tell the story had been, after leading up major research projects for a university in the healthcare space, unemployed for 14 months, totally shocked, but ended up working for a workforce development center, helping other older people find jobs. And so she was really passionate about the issue, but she could also tell her own story. And people could look at her and know that, oh, she had headed up these really big things and all of a sudden had faced this, So we were fortunate to get a couple of people to tell their stories. And I think that's like really important, is trying to identify. I think that's why I've reached out to you at different times and I'm like, you've got a unique ability in what you're doing to get people to tell their stories. So I actually think if we were able to do something like this on a state by state or a national level, the kind of credibility that you've established, Maureen, with the people that you talk to would be a tremendous asset, because you have the gift of getting people to tell their stories. And very often people are reluctant to do that. And that turned out to be really important. So obstacles that we faced were some of the legislators, and this was, I think you've talked on some of your podcasts with people about internalized ageism, right? When we internalize ageism ourselves and we start believing those myths and stereotypes out there. Well, there was an older legislator who literally just stood up on the floor and talked for hours and hours about, well, he was an old guy, and if somebody didn't want to hire him, that was perfectly fine, and he didn't.
Oh, wow.
And he just went on, and we were like, oh my God, like,
wow.
Anyway, he finally sat down, and we were able to overcome that. But some of it actually came from older people. Businesses, after, what was fascinating to me, and you may appreciate this, it was mostly some out-of-state companies who I won't name in the tech space who objected to the bill. And they were like, if we're going to advertise, shocking, right? If we're going to advertise in Colorado, this is going to be a burden to us. And it was like, why would it be a burden, right? So, but that was overcome, and, it ended up being passed. So but those were the kind of hurdles that people were afraid that it would negatively impact their businesses. And of course, we were able to talk about the business case for older workers and intergenerational teams. People thought it would discriminate against younger workers. We were able to show, no, it actually helps younger workers because younger workers are also being screened out. So it was kind of, the good news is we've almost kind of developed a toolkit. So if anybody else wants to do it, we've got all of our arguments, all the counter arguments, what we said, the draft legislation, and everything else. And actually, I'm doing a program on February 19th for the Encore network. And one of the things we're going to talk about is kind of how we did this. So
fantastic. I mean, that's what we need. And I love that you brought a group together, a collective of people all with the same goal, and that you got all these different people to come in and share their stories too. Because to your point, people need both the data and the stories to bring them the data to life. It's really a critical component. And there really is a chilling effect for people who are actively looking for employment. It's hard for them to speak out about this stuff. And it can actually have an adverse impact on their career. That is real. And so I'm glad that you two were able to find people who were willing to do that. And I think all too often it has to come from someone who has, frankly, sadly, given up or gone out on their own and realized that they're going to have to make their way outside of the typical corporate sort of confines because of how systemic ageism really is at this point. But I love that you touched so much and so deeply and focus on the intergenerational business case, because that is core to my belief as well, and what we know based on data as far as business outcomes. Because the reality is we live in a world where profit and corporations, shareholders are king, and that's what's going to drive them to actually do things. The rest of the stuff can often be really performative. And so I think focusing in on something that will, of course, have a wider and greater impact and help all of us, couching all of that in terms that are really about business outcomes and innovation is the way to make the fastest impact, in my opinion. So I love that you do that. But I also love that you have constructed a toolkit of sorts to help us do that. Because let me tell you, podcasts can be tough in terms of, you don't always get all the feedback. It's you and a guest or you by yourself. And you might hear back from some people here and there. But I was fortunate enough to have the chance to actually meet in person in San Francisco at a breakfast with people from the It Gets Late Early community that was sponsored by AARP. And let me tell you, that room was blowing up with energy and drive and interest in getting stuff done, not just talking about it. And so I am so pumped about the toolkit that you have, because I know for a fact that this is something that has so much potential and we can do it across the country. So thank you so much for putting that together. And I want to make sure that we give access to anybody
I'll figure out a way to share it with you, because I mean,
Absolutely.
The goal is, if we could do this, I don't have a lot of confidence right now. I mean, we have some pending laws that have been there for a while in Congress, and given everything that's going on, my confidence level is not really high. But I know that we can do things on a state level, and we're probably going to need to do things on the state and community level. And I think that this is almost easier to get done on a state level, because you can very much customize it to what is going on in that particular state. So you can look at, who are the industries who are really needing workers right now. And that to me is like the huge paradox, right? I call it the perplexing paradox in my workshop. But we've got all of these unfilled jobs, and we say, oh, we don't want you. And I'm like, wait, what's wrong with this picture,
a talent shortage, but the market's flooded with candidates. Make it make sense.
Make it make sense to me. And nobody can, right?
Mm-mm.
So, but the beauty of doing something like this on the state level is you can point to an industry sector that is facing talent shortages and say, look, this can help you, And the other thing that we tried to do is to make it, is to not point fingers and to not blame. And, we could even say to a CEO, look, we realize, that you're over here and there are a lot of layers down and people may be doing things. This also protects you if you pass a law like this and all of a sudden you can't ask age. This is also going to potentially protect you from things like age discrimination lawsuits. So there were lots of ways to kind of, pitch it to employers. And I think that's easier to do on a state by state level where you know who's in the state, you know what industries are really needing talent, and you can kind of solicit those as, kind of part of your supporters. So, and that's kind of, I mean, the toolkit is intended, okay, this is what we learned, share it, do what you want with it, that kind of thing. So
that's fantastic. I definitely want to make that available to people in the It Gets Late Early community. I think there will be a lot of people who will want to just run at that, which is fantastic. And I just, so much credit, such a big hat tip to you for getting this rolling. I keep thinking to myself, a lot of these jobs, they're online, right? And so how people are applying online, obviously, that's what people do now. But I'm wondering, if you have a job that you want to fill and you are putting it out there in an application or an applicant tracking service system, how do you just look by IP address to see who's coming from Colorado and then like filter out the age questions if you're so insistent on keeping them across all states that you can? That's
a really
what I'm curious about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer to that is I don't know. I mean, okay. I have had a lot of people reached out. I wrote a LinkedIn article about this as we were headed into July of last year, knowing that this was going to go into effect. I had a lot of people reach out to me and saying, well, I was applying online. There was this question. I was like, where do you live? And they were like, Texas. And I was like, well, then you could do something in Texas.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
I mean, that I'm not,
Can't help you.
I'm not casting shade on Texas.
No. But they don't have this law.
But they don't have this law. They don't have this law. So I think, so I'm not sure, a lot of applications still ask for your street address, which I think is a little bit weird, but, people do. I also do understand, though, having run a company, before I started changing the narrative, I ran a small consulting company for over 3 decades, and we did have employees in different states. It was important for us to know the state of an applicant, because then it was like, is this a state where we're licensed to do business in? Because for a small company, it's costly to be registered to do business in every state, right?
Because you have nexus in states where you have employees, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got to do it. So there are tax implications, there are registration implications, and that kind of thing, which we discovered when one of our most valued employees moved for 3 years to Chicago, and it is very expensive to do business.
Dang it. Could you go somewhere else?
I was like, and, it was a smart move for her. It was a smart move for us to make sure that we could do business there to retain her. But, those are the kind of things. So I think people ask for addresses and that's how they find out. But my goal, my dream would be that we've got laws like this in every state, so that because it does serve 2 purposes. Not only does it, have that enforcement aspect, but it's an incredible opportunity to educate people about the business case for older workers and intergenerational teams.
Absolutely. So, it's almost like a nice Trojan horse into the conversation, right? Because people are going to be like, what's this? What's this all about? And why do I need to comply with it? Well, here's why. This is important.
Not only why you need to comply.
Exactly.
And
here's why you should
why
anyway.
You want to. Right.
Exactly.
Why you want
exactly.
To. Right.
Which is interesting. I mean, because I feel like there's so this helps people get the at that, right? This helps them get through the ATS system. It helps them, I guess ATS system is redundant, but it gets them through the ATS to the initial point of interview. Certainly we'll have age bias problems that will, surface at the interview process stage, right? Where you're speaking to someone face to face or over Zoom or whatever it is. That's a separate issue, but hopefully with the Trojan horse conversation being broached, that age bias training could also be a part of the equation that can help people overcome that. Because it's fascinating to me, all those studies that you referenced, the resume builder one with what was 42% of hiring managers discriminate against people based on age, too old, too young, air quotes on those. There was another one that came out in, I think it was the Financial Times, that said that something around 50% of recruiters, like people who should definitely know better, thought that age 57 was, quote, too old to hire. So, I mean, we still have that hurdle to overcome, but we got to have baby steps here. And I think we have to celebrate the wins, and it's not going to change overnight, but this is a great way to ensure that people get the chance to show up to the interview. And then, the ball's in your court. Sure, you might have someone who's biased against you on the other side of the phone line or the Zoom screen or in person, whatever. There's not much you can do about that. So like control what you can control, but at least get that shot, right? And so that's what I love about this legislation.
And that, to me, I think what you're bringing up, Maureen, is so important because often people want to have like the one thing, right? What's the magic bullet? And I think in this, when we're dealing with workplace age discrimination, I've always thought that, we need this multi-pronged approach. And so we need the public policy advocacy. And that's one of the things I work on. We need the general public education, so podcasts like yours, that's why that's so important. Doing things like op-eds, getting opinion pieces, articles written. We need to make the business case for employers. So that's what I do through Encore Roadmap. I'm out talking to employers about the business case for older workers and intergenerational teams. And the other piece that we haven't talked about is we also need to reach directly older workers who have absorbed those through internalized ageism, those messages from society, and will say stupid stuff like, oh, I'm not really good with tech, or I can't. And I'm like, and every time I hear anyone who is age 50 or older saying that in my presence, I'm like, you can't say that.
Yeah.
And the reason you can't say that is not only because of you, but it's like about the rest of us, right?
Yes.
If you're saying that, you're also, you're reinforcing a stereotype that has actually been refuted again and again.
Yep.
It was interesting when we were doing this action with LinkedIn, right, to get them to take down their really ageist ads.
It was so bad.
It was so bad, right? It was so bad. But the good news is, it took some effort and it took a number of people.
Right. And for those who don't know what we're talking about real quickly, I just want to point out,
go ahead.
LinkedIn had this ad that was just mind-bogglingly ageist. It was basically talking about the cloud, right? Like the internet, the cloud. And they were making fun of this older person, basically who was posing as more or less a grandmother in this. And she was saying things like, what's the cloud? Like it was really over the top. And then you had the younger person, well, grandma, I mean, it was really like that. So sorry, continue. I just want to make sure people know what we're talking about.
Yeah. So it's pretty bad. And that ad was out at the end of 2023, early 2024. And a group of us, I mean, it took a kind of a coordinated effort. Highly encouraged LinkedIn to take it down, and to their credit, they did. So yay. So that to me is an example of education. It's also an example of advocacy. But one of the things that was fascinating to me was, and I've now used this as part of the business case, the number of people who I had when we were doing the advocacy around that LinkedIn ad on LinkedIn who reached out to me and said, I invented the freaking cloud in my industry and that kind of thing, So I was like, okay, are you willing to be quoted? Do you want to, and to their credit, some of them were. So those are, so it takes all of us, right? It's not, it takes podcast and advocacy like yours. It takes employer education. It takes public policy advocacy, but it also takes all of us who are older saying, you know what? We are absolutely willing to learn new skills, and we're not going to accept those stereotypes, and we're going to reject internalized ageism. So I think it's also important for everybody who does workshops for older adults to say, reject all of that stuff. My mantra personally is, it's not too late. Dreams don't have an expiration date. I had a wonderful role model in a mother who, basically as she was approaching her 60s, she had always wanted to go to college, and she was raised in an immigrant family that sent the boys and not the girls to college. And so she's approaching her 60s. The kids are out of the house. She looks at my dad and she says, Ray, I'm going to college. And she did. And she graduated 4 years later, magna cum laude, fluent not only in her native French and also in English, but also in Portuguese and Spanish, because those were languages spoke in the community where I grew up. And it was really important for her to be able to kind of communicate in their own language to her friends and neighbors. So the idea that you kind of like age out of stuff and that you can't learn new skills at a different age just seems really weird to me. So when people bring that up, I'm like, really? Is that your
demonstrably false?
Yeah. So,
And that's why stories like what you just shared are so important, because people need to know. They need to have the inspiration. If you can see it, you can be it, and all of that. And that's why, I think we're really on the cusp of a movement here, and it's building. I see the wave building, and it's so exciting. I mean, even looking at things in more popular culture, right? Like this topic is hitting mainstream media. And for example, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Elaine from Seinfeld, she had the top podcast of 2023, Wiser Than Me, and she just interviews older, wiser women than she. And what's wonderful is that that's starting, and I think it's starting at sort of the more celebrity level is great. But what I want to see is a trickle-down effect of people who are a little bit more relatable than Jane Fonda, for example, who was great, by the way, but
yeah,
just
no,
more
I totally
everyday
get it.
people. And I think
we,
that's coming,
I call it
right?
democratizing it. Like we've got
Yes,
to have,
exactly.
if it's just in celebrity realm, people, it's too easy for people to dismiss and say,
Yep,
well, yes, but they have this much money. And of course,
exactly.
Jane Fonda and Martha Stewart can look like that because of all of their
Mm-hmm.
money. So we've got to be able to just democratize the whole thing.
Totally.
And we've got to, I think, especially with regards to workforce, need to make it about how we learn from each other. I mean, one of the things that I think
Yes.
is so bizarre about the reasons that managers said they were not hiring Gen Z was they don't have a good work ethic. And I'm like, how did all of us at any point learn a work ethic? You show up at your first job and you do something and somebody goes, you probably don't want to do that around
Yeah,
here or that
exactly.
kind
Like,
of,
ooh,
yeah,
ixnay on that. Yeah.
yeah, and that kind of thing, right? We learn from each other, we watch each other. But if you pushed out all the older people and you refuse to provide training to younger people, of course you're going to have a talent shortage. It's just dumb.
You're making too much sense, Janine. It's
Oh
just
no,
too
I'm rarely
logical.
accused of that. Yeah, I've been accused of being a woke lunatic, but there you
Oh,
go.
good times. Well, I mean, the other thing is like, we're all aging. So I find it funny when people push back against ageism and say it's not real or fake or whatever, because it's like, hey, that's cute. One day you'll learn, just wait. Just you wait. So you'll
Except
be
that you
on this
don't want
train at some point.
Except you don't want people to do that, right? You don't want
No,
them to have to go through it. So I've
of
always
course not.
believed
But
that, I've had the honor and privilege of working a fair amount in American Indian communities in my consulting firm. And I always love that concept of you're doing it not for this generation, but for generations to come, right? And I
maybe we
believe like
should
the
take
work
that.
that we are doing now is, it's not just about us, it's for
Yep.
generations to come. And,
100%.
so,
Yeah, that's a concept we need to bring forward in the world more and more,
right.
I believe. I love that.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on it, but I want to ask you, how
Right.
did you get into this whole mess? Like, what drove you to dive into this in not just one business, but two?
So, I people ask me that all the time, and the answer is probably both a bit more simple and a bit more complicated. I am the kind of kid, and my parents would have said, if you'd asked my parents what is Janine's favorite phrase, they would have said, it's not fair. And so I was the kind of kid who was always looking and saying, it's not fair, and that kind of thing. It was just something that I just saw. And I when I ran my consulting firm, I was privileged to work with it was we worked in the social sector, right? So our clients were private foundations, social enterprises, nonprofit organizations, government agencies. And we always ourselves had an intergenerational team. But there was a particular period in our consulting firm, and it was right after the Great Recession, when all of a sudden, and because we were pretty well known, it was the kind of place that people would always call us and say, my daughter's just graduating from college. Can you help her find something? Or this person's just been laid off. Can you help them? And we were so connected in various communities that we could usually help people, even though that wasn't our mission, but it was just something we did, right? So, but one of the things I noticed, and it was like Great Recession, I was getting the usual amount of calls from parents saying, my daughter, my son just graduated, they'd like to work in this organization. Can you help connect them? But I was getting another kind of call, and it was my husband's just been laid off and he hasn't been able to find another job. And those started mounting. And then there was a head of a foundation who had been a good client for a really long time. And she called me and she said, I don't know what's going on. And she was someone who was well known at connecting people in communities. She said, I'm getting an overwhelming number of people who are in their 50s. I'm getting calls from them saying, can I help them? Would you meet with them? So I realized then in this sort of post-recession that I hadn't put the name on it, ageism, but I realized that people who are basically my age were being pushed out. I was like, this is sort of interesting. So we actually started kind of like a monthly networking group, and I was hearing all of their stories, and the stories were horrible because it was people. And again, I think you'll appreciate this because a lot of them were guys in tech, and they were like, they had never had a problem getting another job. They'd leave one job, they'd get another one, no problem. And this one guy, and I'm just going to call him Sam, and that's not his real name, but to protect his privacy, he was crying in my office one day, and he was like, I don't know how to tell my daughter I can't pay for her college tuition.
Oh my
Like it,
gosh.
that kind of thing. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And I realized that what was behind my it's not fair mantle was, to me, the greatest injustice is waste of human potential. And it doesn't matter what, it's why I was a champion of early childhood education. It's why I've always been involved in women's rights issues. So I was like, this is nuts. So I actually, kind of developed a curriculum to help people kind of repackage their skills. Because I had worked so much in the nonprofit sector, I knew that most people in the nonprofit sector loved to do the work, but they hated the fundraising part. A lot of the people who had been laid off were people in sales and marketing. So I basically developed a kind of a mini course to train people who had sales and marketing backgrounds how to do nonprofit fundraising, right? So I
So
think that was
perfect.
like my
Yeah.
first alert to the issue, but I thought it
Wow.
was a blip because of the recession. I didn't realize it was the staying power of it. And I had no idea that I would end up. I was getting ready to leave my consulting firm to do something else, and I wasn't exactly sure what. And a friend of mine from the same foundation I mentioned said, I want to do an ageism initiative. I want you to run it. I was like, oh, that's a big job, Therese. I don't, I'm looking something part-time. I want to hang on the beach. I don't know how I was going to do that in Colorado, Maureen, but I had
the proverbial beach. Okay.
I had a concept of a plan.
A concept of
a plan. So, and she lied to me. She's my good friend. She lied to me. She said, you can do this part-time. And from that, I think she had the idea that we were going to participate in this national reframing aging initiative. And I probably did 2 or 3 workshops in Colorado on reframing aging when I discovered, like you have, that the big story really is workforce and people being pushed out of workforce. And that was what I was personally passionate about, what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to do something about. So that's kind of how I ended up doing what I'm doing today. The benefit that I've had is because throughout my career, and I think this to me is a great example of how we all build on the strengths and experience we have. I had worked on all kind of social change issues with people who were like leading thinkers in social change. So I kind of knew what you had to do to change, not only hearts and minds, like you needed to be on podcasts, you needed to write ed pieces, you needed to organize people, and you needed to work on public policy. So that was kind of how we set that we were going to do all of that. And I also knew that nobody could do this alone. It was never about, a person doing. You referred earlier, there's a movement emerging. Movements require a bunch of people stepping forward at the same time and hopefully in the same direction. And so, that's why I think my work is important. Your work is important. Anybody who's doing it, if we can step in that same direction and tell stories along the way, I think we can get places. So.
Absolutely. And I find that all just tremendously inspiring. And I'm just really grateful that you took the step out because this is hard. This is really hard stuff. And, changing hearts and minds and getting people to see things in a different way, it's sometimes a slog. And I can tell you, there have been plenty of times when I've been like, got to throw the towel in. So why don't you tell us, I'm curious, how have you persisted when it's gotten hard for you?
Um, the bottles of wine that you don't see on my, no,
Whatever it takes.
no, edit that out.
No shame.
No, I think it really, I think it's all, it is understanding our why, what we do. I think this is essentially in my DNA. It goes back to it's not fair.
It's not fair.
It's not fair. And it is the stories. There was a particular story early on in changing the narrative before we did this huge shift on workforce. I was doing a workshop on ageism and reframing aging, right? What's the language you use, what we don't. And it was in a rural community in Colorado. And there were a group of women, and so it was kind of a lunch and learn, right? Doing the workshop, we've got all the food set up. And there were a group of women, kind of my age, who after the workshop part and we're having the lunch, and then I see them, they've got tote bags and they're taking the refreshments and they're putting them in their tote bags. Now, part of me is really, really grateful. I'm like, great, I don't have to clean up after this, right? Because I'm lugging in all the food, I'm setting it up, and I'm lugging it out after the workshop. They're all in offsite locations. But then I'm like, what is going on here? So I sit down and I chat with them, and it was a group of women my age trying to live on really small amounts of Social Security because, of course, here's what happened. Of my generation, I'm hoping that is somewhat changing, but of my generation, women were paid less than men across our lifetime. We are much less likely to have stepped out of the workplace to care for children, and this is still true for older family members. So what that means is you've got less pension, 401k, Social Security, less savings. And then, so I'm sitting down and I had been staying at a hotel in kind of like the town next door. And I was like, but there are help wanted signs everywhere there.
Yeah.
This was the year before the pandemic. And they were like, oh, yeah, they won't hire us. And that was when I think really what attuned to me was here are retail establishments and restaurants who need employees and a hospital. There was a local hospital. Here are people who could all fill those, all highly capable, right?
Right.
Who had done things, who could fill those jobs. And so I think what keeps me going is that story of these women in Mesa County, Colorado. And I just remember, I can literally remember their faces. I can literally remember sitting down and thinking when I left that night and went back to my hotel, what would it be like to feel like I have to go to a workshop and take refreshments home so that, so I think the why that keeps me going is that, but it's depressing. And, because you're really active on LinkedIn, I suspect even more so than I am. We have a lot of people direct message us, right, with their stories. And that can be really hard. So there are times where I'll take a break for a couple of weeks and I'm like, I can't absorb one more sad story. And then hopefully I can
heartbreaking.
Right? Because you want to help people. And I
keep
wish
saying, you could fix it.
You wish you could fix it. And I don't know if this happens to you. People want me to find them a job. And I'm like, I've never actually even found myself a job. I've always worked for myself. I've always been in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
I can't help you with your resume. I can connect you with people who can.
Right.
But the underlying issue that I always want to let people know is it's not just you. So many people think it's just them and they don't realize it's a systemic issue.
It really is.
That's, to me, again, the beauty of what you're doing is letting people know at the outset, it's a systemic issue. So
it is. And, I think just what we all want to belong. That's one of the core central tenets of being a human. It's just our base instinct. And so I think that in and of itself can be compelling. But, what I love about what you do is you're bringing us out of the, okay, we know it's real, into the, okay, what are we going to do? And we can do things. And as you pointed out, mindset is critically important, and we have to pull ourselves out of these incredibly ageist, stereotypical narratives that have been drilled into us. I mean, I joked about this on my last episode, an episode last year, but I was watching Alvin and the Chipmunks with my kids on Netflix, and there were incredibly ageist things woven into that narrative. My kids are 7 and 10 and they're listening to this. And I'm like, this is where it starts. This is where it starts. It's no one's fault. I'm working on my own ageism. It's we all have this embedded in us. So it's a systemic issue, and then we perpetuate it accidentally. And so it's like you said, you don't want to point fingers because this is all in us and no one meant for this to happen, but we have to very, very deliberately and intentionally try to root it out. And it's going to be a long game, but
Yeah. And I think we can do it. I mean, what gives me hope is that people can do it. I look at, I have 2 millennial age daughters who are both rock stars. And every now and then we were all at the beach together between Christmas and New Year's. We took a family vacation. And I said something and they were like, Mom, you're being ageist. And I'm like, woohoo, okay, you've got it. So it was a reminder to me that I've been doing this work for so long and still,
it
there are
creeps
things
in.
that creeps in. But it was also, okay, they've learned something from
Yeah,
me.
exactly.
So, that's good.
Yes, progress.
So,
progress. And I think, there's a way, it can be a fine line, right? And sometimes humor can help kind of bond us together and share, share different perspectives and whatnot. But there is a fine line. It can go too far pretty fast. But it's, I think clearly you've done a great job if even your daughters are pointing out ageist stereotypes coming out them.
Well, daughters
even from the most unlikely of sources.
Daughters love to point out what their moms are doing wrong, right?
Oh,
so
yes. Yes.
Anyway,
absolutely true. That is so awesome. I'm so excited that you came to the show because I've just admired your work for a very long time. And I know that the people who listen to the show are going to want to get involved, going to want to stand up and make their voices heard in some way, shape, or form, oftentimes, hopefully anonymously, because understandably there is that chilling effect that we spoke about. But where can people go to learn more about what they can do and what you do?
So I think the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. So it's basically LinkedIn, Janine Vanderburg. They can go to my website, Encore Roadmap. But if people message me on LinkedIn or at info@Encore Roadmap, I can send them info to the right, depending on what they're looking for. So Changing the Narrative, co.org has a lot of resources on fighting ageism generally, both in the workplace, but also in other settings. So certainly another great resource, but specifically on the workplace stuff, I think if people check out on LinkedIn, that's where, whenever there's something current or new or whatever, that's where I'm sharing it. So,
yeah, you do publish a lot of articles and they're great. So I definitely encourage everybody to go follow Janine on LinkedIn. And we'll definitely connect in the future to anything else that you come up with in terms of, toolkits or resources to get the audience to go and make their mark and go make some change wherever they happen to live.
Yeah,
we're going to do that. There is definitely a lot of momentum building and people are getting fed up. So I'm really excited about what you're doing and grateful. So
it's
thank
time.
you.
Thank you.